Hello. This set is ridiculous. We got American flag in the background 1, we have American flag in the background 2, we have a flag of England up there because I don't have a British flag, and I'm wearing obnoxious sunglasses. Oh boy, this is going to be great. Hey, what's up everybody, Commander Radix here bringing you another episode of History and Lore, my series where I talk about history and lore. So today, assuming that I've released this video correctly, is America Day. I feel very sorry for those of you who don't live in America. Like me, I do not live in America, but you know, I can dream. Because you don't get to enjoy the beauty of America Day, where they blow up explosives in the sky of every major city. 1,000 fattened calves are slain in order to produce the most exquisite of hamburgers, much like a great Old Testament temple sacrifice. People on Twitter complain that it's racist, but they do that every day, so it doesn't really matter. But you might be left wondering, why do we, and by we I mean the entire world, celebrate America Day? Well, the full name of America Day, I gotta stop doing that, that will be annoying when I'm having to edit this video. The full name is American Independence Day. This is the day when America, or rather the United States of America, declared independence from the Kingdom of Great Britain, with the ratification of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. So some of us, if we haven't had a basic education in the American public school system, might be wondering, why did America declare independence from Great Britain? And I'm going to give you 8 reasons why here in this video today for our episode of History and Lore. Now these are 8 reasons. This is not a complete list. It's not meant to be a complete list. It's just meant to be 8 reasons. Some of the key reasons America declared independence. Other reasons do exist, but we won't be getting into them today. And I should also mention that these are not in any particular order. Reason number 1, cultural divergence. So this is in the 18th century. It takes months to cross the Atlantic Ocean. It took longer, a century before that. The United States is being formed out of the 13 colonies. 13 colonies that exist on the eastern seaboard of the United States today. And Great Britain, of course, is all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to the northwest of Europe. When you have such a big gap, a big ocean between you and the motherland, there are going to be cultural differences. The English language makes phonetic shifts between the two different English-speaking populations. I should also note that different populations from different parts of England go over to different particular parts of the 13 colonies. For example, a lot of East Anglians end up moving to places like Massachusetts. A lot of people in the north of England, on the border regions with Scotland, end up going to places like the frontier land of the 13 colonies. If you want to learn more about settlement patterns in the 13 colonies from England, I highly recommend David Hackett Fisher's Albion's Seed, 4 British Folkways in America. Very major text when it comes to, and it's huge, but it will help you learn a lot about the culture of the 13 colonies and how it comes from England. I went off on a tangent. Different conceptions of things like liberty, and we'll get to that later. Different ideas around government, right? We'll talk about that later. But there's, after generations upon generations, right? We are over 100 years after the first settlers set down in Jamestown. You know, check out my video I made on Jamestown, by the way. The Americans are thinking of themselves as being Americans. You know, so many of them are starting to say, why should we answer to the crown in London when we are so far away? Speaking of government, let's talk about taxes. One of the 2 certain things in this life. So the American Revolution and the American Declaration of Independence all sort of happens as the in the setting of the ending of the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War was a massive conflict, basically a World War Zero. And one of the key features of the war included Great Britain spending a lot of money, sending a lot of troops to go fight in the colonies to fight against France. At this point in time, before the war started, the British colonies were sort of kept to themselves, sort of locked off, densely populated, but surrounded by New France, a big colony, if you could call it that, controlled by France, or at least claimed by France. Not as densely populated, but it certainly was a lot of land that the densely populated 13 colonies wished they had to spread out west. It was getting kind of cramped in Virginia. And part of the reason the 7 Years' War broke out in the American colonies, we call it the French and Indian War, was over that desire for land and over competing claims to the west. Now, of course, in 1763, right? I hope I have that date right. I don't have notes for this, although that's probably obvious. In 1763, the British Empire wins the 7 Years' War. #based. And as a result, New France is basically wiped off the map. It all goes to the British Empire, right? You now have a huge British Canada. Britain has claims to the west, but we also have something called Pontiac's Rebellion, or Pontiac's War. What is Pontiac's War? I did a video on that. Basically, the French had more or less, when compared to the British, positive relations with the American Indians in their colonies, while the British didn't, compared to the French. Now, when all that territory is lost from France to Britain, some American Indians believe that the British are going to enact the same policies they had in the 13 colonies, only this time out west. And sort of as a defensive move, if you could call it that, is an Ojibwe Indian named Pontiac led this huge rebellion, or this huge war against the British, almost took out the 13 colonies. Again, you should see my Pontiac's War video for more details on that. And basically the British said, wow, that war was intense. I am not ready to fight another war. I am not ready to piss off the American Indians. So hey, American colonists, I'm going to draw a line. That's basically where the border was before the war, and I'm just going to tell you, you can't go past that line. The Americans, who basically fought the war for the right to expand west, weren't really happy about that. I realize that the proclamation line is one of the reasons I have on this list, so I'm talking about these reasons out of order and interchangeably. They're sort of overlapping with each other, because this was supposed to be about taxation. But anyway, that's the proclamation line of 1763. Really ticked off the Americans because they fought a whole world war wanting to get land. They win the war, but then they're told they can't get the land. Let's go back to taxation, which has now become number 3 for some reason. Of all the reasons of the American Revolution, you probably have heard this one the most, that in order to pay off the debts accumulated from the 7 Years' War, the British Empire began taxing the American colonies. Now, this isn't a, oh my god, taxation is theft, rise up now, don't tread on me type deal. We need to understand the full context of this taxation. Historically, the American colonies were under different administrations at different points in time. A national tax from the British Empire onto the 13 colonies wasn't the norm. The Americans sort of flourished in the Americas, in the 13 colonies, and sort of enjoyed this sort of tax-free, at least from the overarching empire perspective. Of course, they paid taxes to their local, governors, but never did they have to pay well, I shouldn't say never, but they didn't usually have to pay taxes to London. Now, after generations of not paying these taxes, the Americans are now being told that they need to pay these taxes. From the British perspective, it's to pay their fair share. After all, Britain itself had pretty high taxes. The average person in Britain was being taxed much more than the American colonist was being taxed. However, it's not so much the taxation amount in and of itself, and more of the principle from the American perspective of that. You've never taxed us before. And the key point, and this goes into another reason, I forgot what reason we're on, reason number 4, I think, Enlightenment ideas. Britain is a constitutional monarchy, right? It has a monarch with certain rights. However, there's also the Parliament, which is more or less a body of elected representatives who, in census create legislation. So one big issue the Americans had was that they were paying money to a constitutional monarchy through taxes, even though they themselves were not represented in Parliament. They were not represented in this organization that had the authority to tax them. Now, I know someone's going to bring it up. I'm going to make it clear here that we're talking about reasons for the Declaration of Independence and for the rebellion. I understand that Britain did offer some form of representation to the colonies at one point. Okay, so at this point in time, we're in something called the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was pretty cringe. The Enlightenment was an overall, basically intellectual, philosophical movement in Europe, especially Western Europe at this time, where Europeans coming fresh off the, well, maybe not fresh off, but off the Protestant Reformation and the 30 Years' War, are starting to think, and that was a mistake, they're starting to think, especially as you're getting away from the teachings of the church and moving away to a Protestant individualized sense of religion, and thereby an individual sense of philosophy, you get people thinking that the individual is the key unit of society and not this, sort of collective mass, not the whole of mankind. And as individuals have certain rights. Man, I don't like talking about the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment's so cringe. But anyway, Enlightenment ideas really hit the intellectual class of the 13 colonies, especially people like Thomas Jefferson. I love you, Thomas Jefferson. I'm sorry you had to be such a big Enlightenment loser. Alexander Hamilton, too, for that matter. Benjamin Franklin, him in and of himself, is an Enlightenment thinker. And with these Enlightenment ideas come old ideas like democracy, ideas that government should be of the people, by the people, for the people.
But the people are retarded.
As opposed to the traditional, some way, shape, or form monarch tradition that had existed in European, and I'm including American in this broad European sense, culture. Now, of course, England had to be different. England has a history that sort of weakened the power of the monarch and led to the rise of a constitutional monarchy. So that tradition also is playing a role in the American culture, which descends from English culture. Americans would look at things like the Magna Carta as being sort of a key document that led to the heritage of sort of an American democratic enlightened identity. So there's the idea that, okay, to Enlightenment thinkers, the idea that the American people, a separate culture group living in a colony across the sea from a tiny island country, should be subject to the monarch who is decided by family ties of that country is ridiculous to the Enlightenment thinkers. And if I could, this is sort of a step away from, for example, traditional Christian culture, which had a sort of theology on what a king was and how Christians should relate to authority, right? But now through the Protestant Reformation, through the Enlightenment, we're sort of backing away from that traditional Christian understanding of reality. Now let's add another reason to that. The Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts were applied at different points in American history. There is a plane flying above me. I don't know if you can hear it. It's really annoying. It's most definitely an American military plane, which is ironic given the overt Americanness of this video. Okay, I think the American imperialists are gone. Let's continue talking about America. We were talking about the Navigation Acts. Now, the Navigation Acts were big after the 7 Years' War, but they still applied before the 7 Years' War. And they basically limited the economic trade of the colonies to being trade only between the colonies and England. The colonies couldn't trade their goods independently with the Dutch, with the French, with the Spanish. All the exports should be going straight to Britain, was the idea of the Navigation Acts, which hurt the American economy incredibly. So already do we have a cultural divide? Do we have a philosophical divide? But now the Americans are being hurt economically by being part of the English Empire, or the British Empire. That's going to lead to some revolutionary ideals. Well, okay, socially, were the British nice to the Americans? Not really. The British very much looked down upon their American subjects. We have several primary sources from things like the 7 Years' War, where a large amount of British from Britain soldiers were deployed to the Americas. For a while, actual British people from Britain coming to America wasn't really in a big wave. It was big like in the early 1600s, 1620s, and so on, 1640s even. But by the 1750s, that wasn't so common. You had much more Irish and German immigrants at that point in time. But with the 7 Years' War, you have British troop deployments in the Americas, and they kind of look down on American colonial society because it's basically the backwaters of the English Empire. We have primary sources of sort of battle reports, where the British soldiers kind of look at their American soldier counterparts and say, these guys don't know what they're doing. For example, the Radix expedition, which happened in the 7 Years' War. There is an incident where American and British troops go into the woods, and then they get jumped on by the French and their Indian allies. The British kind of panic immediately and start like breaking formation, accidentally doing friendly fire. The Americans come in, get in the way, but they still stand and fight the Indians. And then the British are like, why are you standing in the way of our fire? So there's this incident where the British at first are kind of afraid, and you know what, fair, I probably would be too, when all of a sudden the trees start speaking Iroquois or whatever. But then they break formation. The Americans just storm in without a plan. They're brave, I'll give them that, to just run into this battlefield, but also no plan, get in the way of the British guns. It's a disaster. But you really see in the primary sources of those texts where the Americans are like, wow, these British officers that were in charge of us, that were treating us like crap, are now all of a sudden really scared in battle, huh? And then you have the British primary sources saying, the Americans are idiots, they just charged in without a plan and ruined everything. General Braddock ends up dying. But there very much is this sort of prejudice between the British and the Americans, and the British looking at the Americans as being more rural, shall we say. And the Americans don't really like being seen like that, especially up in New England, like Massachusetts. Okay, so socially, economically, things aren't good. Socially, things aren't good. Politically, things aren't good. Are things at least religiously good? Can't we say we're all Christians? That brings us to our seventh reason. There is a huge religious divide in between the American colonies and England, and really between the American colonies themselves. But England at this time is Christian, predominantly of the Church of England, Anglican, right? And you certainly do have Anglicanism in the 13 colonies, especially in the southern colonies, in Virginia, in the Carolinas, for example. But sort of the dominating, the upper class, the dominating intellectual class, the dominating merchant class up in New England are basically strands of Protestantism that comes from Puritanism. Although by the time of the American War of Independence, Puritanism in and of itself isn't so popular, but you do have this huge movement of sort of Calvinistic religion in the 13 colonies. And at a time when the Anglican Church is a little bit more high church, a little bit more traditional, you have these Puritan strands of Christianity that are much more Calvin. If you're American, you know what I'm talking about. If you live in the South and you're Catholic and you know all your Baptist friends, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Very big differences in how they see things like the sacraments, how they see things like the text, the role of the Bible, the role, what salvation is. Religiously, huge differences that have grown, mostly because the Puritans sort of ejected from England like an escape pod after the English Civil War and colonized the New World. Yes, I know that's a simplification. I know I'm going to get comments saying that's a simplification. And the English aren't so fond of the Puritans at this point in time, right? There's still, the trauma of the English Civil War floating in the background, the trauma of the Puritans taking over the government, killing the king, and banning Christmas. And those people and their descendants are who's basically ruling at least the northeast part of the 13 colonies. Oh, I missed part of my reasons. Back to the disrespect reason, there's also the Quartering Act, where British soldiers were allowed to stay in American homes and basically eat whatever they got to give them, right? Americans had the legal obligation, the legal responsibility to provide homes for British soldiers. That wasn't fun for the Americans. Can you imagine just chilling at home and then some foreign soldier just walks into your house and says, "Hey mate, you gotta let..." I shouldn't do that. And says, "Hello, I am a normal human being just like you. Can I eat all of your grain?" Anyway. And now we come to the last reason on this list, and of course the order doesn't matter, but why did the United States of America, declare independence from the Kingdom of Great Britain? And that's because by July 4th, 1776, the war had already begun. Sometimes we don't think about this. We think, oh yeah, American Revolution, 1776, starts with the Declaration of Independence. 1776 will commence again if you try to take the guns. But the fact of the matter is, the rebellion did not start in 1776. The open warfare started in 1775 with the battles of Lexington and Concord, where you see American militiamen engage the British, right? You start to see the Continental Army start to form up. Let me fact check myself to make sure I didn't anachronistically place the Continental Army in 1775. Oh, I'm right. Another victory for Commander Radix. But yeah, the war was already going on. At this point, right, you have the Olive Branch petition where the Americans try to say, hey, Britain, let's be chill, we can talk this out. That was rejected, but there were also British efforts to make peace before even that. But by 1776, negotiations had failed. The Continental Congress felt a responsibility to take drastic action. And that's basically one of the big reasons why 1776 is when the United States of America declared independence from Great Britain. Anyway, so thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. If you are from the American public school system, you probably did not learn anything new, but whatever. But as I plan on releasing this on July 4th, I think it's important that we remember why this day is celebrated in America and rightfully everywhere. I kid, I joke. Please don't take my joke seriously. But yeah, thank you all so much for watching. Subscribe to this channel if you have not yet. Follow me on social media, especially Twitter and Discord. Check out my channel for more history-related content, and have a great day, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, I wanna be the hunter, not the hunted. I wanna be the king.